I knew I had lost my children the very moment the medical staff zipped the body bag closed around my husband. Not because of death. Death does not break a family. Silence does. And silence was all I received from the two children who once used to fight over who got to sleep beside their mother whenever a storm rolled in. They stood there, looking at me, as if waiting for me to confess to some crime, a crime I had never owed them. The world around me began to blur. The echo of ambulance sirens in the parking lot, the cold glare of hospital hallway lights, condolences falling like meaningless whispers, but their eyes did not blur. They were sharp, sharp as razors. Trayvon clenched his jaw so tightly the muscles in his face twitched. Latoya folded her arms across her chest, so tight her fingernails carved pale crescent moons into her skin. My name is Maxine Holloway, and on the day my husband died, my children turned me into someone they needed to stay away from. At Henry Ford Hospital, the doctor led us into a cold consultation room, closed the door, and told us Frederick's heart had stopped after prolonged strain. I felt the floor tilt beneath my feet. They felt as if something had just been confirmed. Trayvon finally looked up at me, not with the eyes of a son who had just lost his father, but with something darker, something that had been decided long ago. Throughout the funeral, they stood only inches away from me, close enough that outsiders would think they were standing beside me, but far enough that I couldn't reach them. People whispered around us, "The children will help her through this." I wanted to ask, which children? The ones standing next to me physically, or the ones who had already left me emotionally from this very moment? If you're still watching at this point, type in the comments what time it is where you live right now. Just a number is enough. It helps me remember I'm speaking to people who won't look at me the way my children looked at me that day. After the service, I tried to sit with them. Latoya wrapped a sandwich with unnecessary force, as if the bread itself had offended her. Trayvon rearranged the chairs, as though the room was bothering him. I gently reached my hand toward him. He flinched and stepped back. Then he said one sentence, just a simple sentence, but it slid straight into me like a blade cutting between my ribs. Dad would still be alive if the house wasn't always so tense. He didn't finish the thought. He didn't need to. In that moment, I understood something clearly. My children had cast me as the villain in a story I hadn't even been invited into to tell. That night, they went back to their own homes, leaving me to walk out of the funeral hall without a single hand reaching for mine. They said they would call, promised they would check on me. They didn't. And if you think that silence lasted only a few days, you're wrong. Because what came after the funeral wasn't short-term grief, but a deliberate disappearance, one that changed my life in ways none of us could have imagined. In the next part, I'll tell you what happened when my first messages never received a reply. Before everything fell apart, we were a real family. Frederick and I met at a church dance in 1978. He wore a brown suit that fit a little too loosely at the shoulders, smiled ear to ear, and danced the two-step so clumsily I couldn't stop laughing. "If you teach me how to dance," he said, laughing as he awkwardly spun me around, "I'll teach you how to fix anything in the house." And he kept that promise. 32 years of marriage, Frederick fixed every leaking pipe, every jammed window, every wobbly chair. But more than that, he fixed the distance between me and the outside world whenever I felt too small to stand in it. Trayvon was born in 1981. Latoya came 2 years later. Frederick called them his rescue team, 2 angels sent to save a man from taking life too seriously. On Sundays, we sat together on the long wooden pews of Shiloh Baptist Church. Frederick always held my hand through the hymns. Trayvon often fell asleep on his shoulder. Latoya asked loud questions at the quietest possible moments. "Mom," she whispered, nothing about it quiet. "Why does Mrs. Jenkins wear such a big hat?" Frederick had to bite his lip to keep from laughing. But somewhere in those years, there were cracks I didn't see. Frederick worked double shifts at the metal pressing plant in River Rouge. He came home with heavy shoulders and tired eyes. I tried to make things easier: dinner on time, a quiet house, well-behaved children. But sometimes I needed him to fix something, needed him to talk to Trayvon about skipping school, needed him to look at me and say everything would be okay. "Maxine, I'm exhausted," he would say at times like that. "Can't you handle it yourself?" Those moments weren't many, but the children remembered them clearly. There are moments in life when you don't realize you're being watched. No one says anything. No one argues. But someone is taking notes. And years later, those small moments become evidence for a verdict you never knew you would have to face. One night in 2004, LaToya was 19. She overheard me calling Frederick while he was still at the factory. "I need you to come home," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't feel right." My voice trembled. I had a high fever and dizziness, but I didn't want to alarm anyone. Frederick came home immediately and took me to the hospital. A urinary tract infection had spread to my kidneys. He sat beside my hospital bed all night, holding my hand without letting go. But when we returned home, LaToya looked at me differently. "Mom is always calling Dad back home," she said to Trayvon, thinking I couldn't hear. "He works so hard and Mom just—" She didn't finish the sentence, but from that moment on, I began to feel like a burden. Frederick never made me feel that way, but he never stopped the children from thinking that way either. Then came March 14th, 2006. Frederick was fixing the sink in the basement when I heard a loud sound, a heavy fall. I ran downstairs. He was lying on the cold concrete floor, pale, one hand clutching his chest. "Call 911, he gasped. Trayvon and LaToya were there when the ambulance arrived. They saw me panicking, sobbing, gripping Frederick's hand as the paramedics lifted him onto the stretcher. They saw me. And somewhere in that moment, they decided that I was the reason this had happened. The next day, I sent them a picture of the rose bushes Frederick used to tend. The message was opened. Then, nothing. I sent a voice message next. "I miss you so much, baby." The message was played. No one replied. On the fourth day, I sent one last text, a mother's plea disguised as an invitation. "Come home, sweetheart. We don't have to talk. Just sit with me." Trayvon opened the message. LaToya's typing bubble appeared, then vanished. That was the last day my children behaved as if I still existed. The house didn't fall silent all at once. It dimmed in pieces. First, the phone that never rang anymore. Then the picture frames on the walls. They started to feel haunted, as if they were watching me with the eyes of people who had left. I tried to keep my children's voices inside this house in every way I knew how. I sent LaToya pictures of the backyard after the rain, of the way the roses bloomed exactly the way her father used to love. I recorded short voice notes for Trayvon, little updates, what I bought at the market that day, how the bake sale at church went, how the weather was changing with the season. I kept my tone light, ordinary, as if by not sounding sad, I could keep them from having an excuse to avoid me. Nothing changed. The messages still showed read, and their silence felt like sealed graves. Loneliness is a sound you only start to recognize once everything else has faded. The hum of the refrigerator, the click of the porch light switching on and off, the echo of your own voice when you speak out loud, just to remember what you sound like. I told myself I was just giving them space, that maybe grief moves differently in everyone. But then the days began to stack on top of each other, like piles of dirty laundry no one bothered to touch. There is a kind of pain that doesn't explode, it doesn't scream, it doesn't collapse, it just stretches on. And every day you wake up, you have to ask yourself, how much longer am I going to keep knocking before I accept that no one is standing on the other side anymore? I called LaToya on her birthday, left a voicemail, with a prayer in it and a catch of laughter and tears stuck in the same breath. She didn't call back. A week later, I tried again. I sent a small package, the lotion she liked, and a picture of me and her father laughing by the lake. The package came back, the seal untouched. I started sending even smaller things. Postcards, handwritten notes, recipes LaToya's grandmother had once taught me. Each time I sent something, I told myself I was just keeping the door open, keeping love alive. But each envelope that returned felt like a slap, soft, but sharp enough to sting for a long, long time. Trayvon's coldness had a different shape. He never said anything cruel. He just erased me from his life with silence. When his work anniversary came, I baked him a lemon pound cake he loved, wrapped it carefully, and mailed it express. I pictured him cutting the cake, maybe sharing it with coworkers, maybe, just maybe, realizing his mother was still trying. The box came back 10 days later, the postal tape still clean, edges still crisp. A red label slapped across the top, undeliverable to address. I had written his address correctly, and I understood what that really meant. The distance between a mother and her children isn't measured in miles. It's measured in unopened gifts, in messages that never find a voice on the other end. I walked through the house, touching objects that once stood for love. The mug Trayvon bought me one Christmas. The photo album LaToya once begged to take to her own place. All of it was still here with me. They were the ones who had moved on. And I was becoming a chapter they didn't want to reread. In their silence, I tried to be understanding. They had their own lives, their own pain, their own coping mechanisms. But a mother's mind never lets her rest. Every night I lay awake, replaying every argument I could remember. Every time my tone was sharp, every time I sounded demanding. I wondered if I had leaned on Frederick too much while he was alive, if they blamed me for always calling him when I felt unwell, for letting him shoulder too many responsibilities. Maybe they saw that as weakness. Maybe they saw me as a burden. And when he was gone, there was no one left to translate my love into a language they could understand. It is a strange thing, trying to forgive people who are still alive, but behave as if you are dead. You keep reaching through the glass, tracing the outline of a family that no longer answers when you knock. A few months later, I packed another box. Not big, just 2 picture frames, a birthday card, and the scarf LaToya had given me years ago. I wanted her to have it back. I took it to the post office with my hands trembling, asked the clerk to please make sure it really got delivered this time. He smiled politely, printed the label, and slid the box into the bin. A week later, it appeared again on my front porch, as if it had never left. Same tape, same handwriting, but this time there was one new stamp pressed clearly across the front. Return to sender. This time I noticed a small detail. One corner of the box was slightly crushed. Someone had picked it up, looked at it, and still decided to send it back. That night, I sat on the living room floor, the box in front of me, and finally let myself cry in a way I hadn't since the funeral. Not the quiet tears, but the deep, shaking sobs, the kind that make you feel like a child who has lost her mother. I cried for the woman who used to believe a mother's love was indestructible, for the woman who thought that if she tried long enough, hard enough, her children would come back, for the woman who still didn't understand that some people simply do not want to be found. The next morning, I called Mrs. Clara Washington, an older woman who lived near the end of the street. She had been widowed longer than I had, and her children lived in Atlanta but still called every Sunday. "Maxine, baby," she said as soon as she heard my voice. "You sound like you're carrying the whole world on your shoulders." "Mrs. Clara," I whispered, "how do you live without expecting them?" The line went quiet for a moment. Then she spoke, her voice gentle but firm. "You have to live for yourself, Maxine. As long as you don't, you'll always be waiting for somebody else to give you permission to matter." Those words haunted me for weeks, because deep down, I knew she was right. I was living like a ghost in my own house, waiting for messages that never came, hoping for a knock from people who had already changed the locks. Then, on a blistering August afternoon in 2009, 3 years after Frederick died, I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the woman staring back. She was thinner, her eyes were hollow, her hair was graying and uncombed, her clothes hung loosely from her frame, and she looked like someone waiting for permission just to exist. That day, I deleted Trayvon's and LaToya's phone numbers from my contacts, not out of hatred, out of self-preservation. I needed to stop my fingers from finding their names every time loneliness pressed in. But I kept the old messages. They were proof that I had tried, that love had been there, even if it was never returned. At least that's what I told myself. until illness came and proved that one-sided love cannot save you when your own body begins to betray you. The first sign was fatigue. Not the kind of tired that comes from crying too much or not sleeping, but a bone-deep exhaustion that seemed to live in my marrow. I would stand up from the sofa and feel as if I'd just walked uphill. Just carrying a basket of laundry from the bedroom to the washing machine sent my heart racing, as if someone was pounding on the inside of my chest. My hands started dropping things more often. Tiny tremors appeared at the smallest, most ordinary moments, and I tried to hide them, even from myself. At first, I blamed grief and age. Widows were expected to slow down. Widows were supposed to sit more, sigh more. Then came the night sweats. I'd wake up with my nightgown glued to my back, the sheets damp, the room cold, but my body burning like it had a fever. I changed pillowcases, folded a dry towel, and kept it beside the bed for the next night. I told myself, it's just stress, just the weight of all these empty rooms pressing down. I kept moving, because I knew that if I stopped, everything would crash down at once. One afternoon, while rubbing the back of my neck, I felt a small lump raised just under the skin. Just a little swelling, tender when I pressed it. A week later, it wasn't just one lump. There were two. My clothes started to hang loosely on me. People at church said I looked smaller, slimmer, using soft words, but their eyes were hard as stone. I moved to sit in the back row, near the exit. Leaving early was easier than staying and having to explain a face they no longer recognized. I scheduled an appointment at the clinic after I caught myself bracing my hands against the kitchen counter just to catch my breath after stirring a pot of food. The nurse took my vitals, frowned, then left the room more than once. The air in that tiny exam room grew thick, as if the walls themselves were holding back a secret. When the doctor finally walked in, he didn't sit down right away. He looked at the chart first, then lifted his gaze to me, and I saw something shift behind his eyes, a kind of carefulness that made the hairs on my arms stand up. He spoke slowly, choosing each word as if saying the wrong one might cut into me. He said it was a kind of blood cancer called non-Hodgkin lymphoma. He said it explained the weight loss, the sweats, the swollen spots. He sketched out a treatment plan with gentle strokes of his pen, as if drawing a map for someone who had never left home. I heard words like chemotherapy. I heard aggressive but treatable. I heard, you're going to need support. Support. That word landed heavier than cancer. If you've ever sat in an exam room and heard your doctor say a single word that makes every other sound disappear, you'll know this feeling. People think the worst moment is when you hear the word cancer. But sometimes the most terrifying moment is when the doctor asks, in an emergency, who should we call? And your mind goes completely blank. If you've ever found yourself sitting there, surrounded by people who all have a hand to hold, while yours clutches nothing but your own handbag, stay with me. Because what comes next is when I realized I wasn't just sick in my blood. I was sick in the very relationships I once thought were unbreakable. On the bus ride home, the city slid past the window in long smears of color. I held the folder of test results on my lap as if it belonged to someone else's life, not mine. When I got home, I set it down on Frederick's side of the bed. For a long time, I just stood there, staring at his empty pillow, remembering all the nights he'd say, "If you ever feel off or scared, you call me right away." He would have picked up on the first ring, but his children hadn't picked up in months. Even so, I still tried. My fingers knew both their numbers by heart, no contacts needed. I called Trayvon first. It went straight to voicemail. I left a short message, trying to keep my voice steady, told him I'd just come back from the doctor, that I needed to talk to him. I didn't mention the word cancer. I called LaToya next. The phone rang, then clicked, shifted straight into silence. A few minutes later, my screen lit up with her text. "Mom, please don't make me responsible for everything." I stared at the sentence until the letters blurred. There was no, "What did the doctor say?" No. Are you okay? Just a boundary line, drawn in cold ink. In that moment, I understood a truth that was both cruel and crystal clear. They didn't want more information, because information might pull them back into my life. That night, I sat on the living room floor again. This time, I didn't cry. I just felt empty. I looked at the phone in my hand and thought about all the times I'd imagined that day, the day my children would need me. The day they would call, panicked, apologizing, saying they wanted to come home. The day they'd wake up and realize their mother was still here. That day never came. Instead, I got one message, telling me not to bother them. The weeks that followed moved as thick and slow as wet cement. Appointments, blood tests, scans. Nurses speaking in hushed tones every time they pressed a needle into my skin. I learned the hums, beeps, and clicks of the machines by heart. Learned the rhythm of the waiting room where other people had hands to hold. I had my purse, my coat, and a phone that hardly ever lit up for anyone but the hospital. On the first day of treatment, I sat back in the recliner, wrapped in a thin blanket, while a clear bag of medication dripped slowly into my vein. Across from me, a woman about my age sat with a teenage granddaughter, their hands woven tightly together the whole time. On the other side, a man leaned back with his eyes closed, his wife beside him reading aloud from a worn paperback, her voice steady and low like a lullaby. The room was full of pairs, husband and wife, grandmother and grandchild, sister and sister, friend and friend. I was the only one, alone. When the nurse removed the IV line and pressed a fresh bandage over my arm, she gently pushed my chair down the hallway and into the oncologist's office so he could go over the instructions. He ran through the list of side effects, the danger signs, the things that could happen late at night. Then he paused, his pen hovering over a blank line on the form. "If something happens and we can't reach you," he asked, his voice still kind but direct, "who should we call in case of emergency?" I sat there, feeling every unanswered message, every returned package, every silence flooding into that small room. Then I swallowed, straightened my back, and gave him the only honest answer I had. "There isn't anyone." He looked up. No one at all?" "No one," I repeated. "It's just me." His face softened in a way that made me want to turn away, but I kept my chin lifted. "I'm very sorry," he said quietly. "So am I," I replied. And that was the truth. I was sorry, not because of the illness, but because even disease wasn't enough to bring my children back. That night, I lay in bed with my hand over my chest, feeling my heartbeat, still beating, still fighting, and I thought, if this heart is strong enough to keep going when no one really cares whether it does, then maybe I'm strong enough to keep living too. But God, it was so incredibly hard. The first year after the diagnosis felt like living forever in a waiting room that never emptied. Appointments, tests, treatments, waiting for results. Meanwhile, life outside the hospital shrank down to whatever I could manage between waves of exhaustion. Even so, I still tried to save a small corner of strength for my children. I sent Trevon and LaToya short, polite messages. "Treatment went fine today, just a bit tired. The sunset looked beautiful when I left the clinic." Sometimes I added a few photos of the hospital window, a bouquet of flowers, a pot of stew someone had brought me. No 4 lines, no needles. I just wanted to send them the last ordinary scraps in a patient's life. The messages showed sent, sometimes read. No reply. Not a single, "Are you okay, Mom?" Just silent proof that my words stopped at their phone screens. Holidays still came, as they always do, whether the house is full or empty. That winter, I put up a small Christmas tree. No more Trayvon wrapping the lights. No more LaToya fighting for the best spot to hang ornaments. I took a picture of the tree and sent it to them both. "Miss you. Your dad would have loved this tree." Trayvon opened the message, said nothing. LaToya didn't even open it. The more intense the treatment became, the less I texted. Not because I loved them less, but because my body no longer had the strength to keep chasing people who never once turned back. Many days I typed half a sentence and erased it. My pain slowly came to be measured by the length of the messages I never sent. The hospital became the place where my name was spoken the most. "Ms. Maxine," the nurses called, their voices gentle. The cafeteria staff greeted me like a regular. At home, no one called me at all. Angela, a volunteer with a bright scarf and eyes that were tired but warm, started bringing magazines and puzzle books into the infusion room. One afternoon, she set a cup of ginger tea beside me. "Do you have someone to take you home?" she asked. I nodded out of habit, then stopped. "No, on good days I drive myself. On bad days, I take the bus." Angela glanced around the room. Most patients had family sitting with them. She folded her arms, speaking softly. "You shouldn't be here alone this much." I could have told her my husband was gone and my children were alive, but had disappeared from my life. I could have described every unanswered message, every gift returned untouched, but I just gave a thin smile that never reached my eyes. "It's all right. I'm used to it." Angela didn't press. She just nodded and squeezed my shoulder. That simple touch stayed with me longer than most of my children's hugs had in years. At home, I stopped mentioning the hospital in my texts. I switched to harmless things. "Saw that old show you used to love on TV today." "Drove past your old school this morning." No response, no questions. It was obvious. They didn't want details, because details came with responsibility. One evening, after a particularly brutal round of treatment that left my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped my keys, I decided to text LaToya one more time. Not a long message, not begging, just 3 words. "I miss you." Simple, bare, impossible to misunderstand. The phone showed sent. A few seconds later, a small gray line appeared. "Messages to this number are no longer being delivered." My stomach hollowed out. I called back. No ringing at all, just a brief silence. Then the automated voice. "This number is no longer in service." I checked again. The same notification. Small, neat, merciless. My daughter didn't text back, didn't call, didn't ask how much poison was being pumped into her mother's veins. She chose something cleaner, sharper, more final. No words, no explanation. LaToya had blocked my number. If you've ever tried calling into a line that's been cut off, you'll understand. It's not just lost contact. It's the moment you realize the person on the other end has actively erased you from their world. And right when that door slammed shut, I had no idea I was walking toward another one. A doorway into a meeting that would change everything. Meeting the one man who looked at me not as a medical file, but as a human being still worth keeping. The morning I met him, my body felt as if it had been scraped out from the inside. The treatment the day before had hit harder than usual. Metallic taste in my mouth, legs heavy as lead, hallway lights so bright they seemed to expose every weakness. I sat in a small exam room, hands clasped together, staring at the crinkled exam table paper shifting under each breath. The door opened. I braced myself for another white coat, rushed eyes, a voice reading instructions in a hurry. But the man who walked in was tall, his doctor's coat folded over one arm, stethoscope around his neck, carrying a kind of calm that didn't feel rehearsed. His hair was gray at the temples, his dark brown skin lined with the creases of someone who had delivered bad news too many times. He didn't look at the chart first. He looked at me. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, his voice low and steady. "I'm Maxine," I answered. "Just call me Maxine." He gave the smallest smile, the kind that respects boundaries, not pushes past them. "I'm Dr. Kenneth Rhodes," he introduced himself. "I consult here at the clinic and run a survivorship support program across town. Your oncologist asked me to take a closer look at your case." He didn't sit behind the desk. He pulled the nearest chair toward the exam table, closing the distance without crowding me. Up close, I could see the tiredness in his eyes, not from lack of sleep, but from everything he'd had to witness over the years. He skimmed my chart, then gently closed the folder. "How have you been tolerating treatment lately?" Most doctors ask that for the sake of protocol. He asked it as if the answer actually mattered. I told him, in pieces, the crushing fatigue, the nights soaked in sweat, the days when every bite of food turned into cardboard in my mouth. I didn't mention the empty house, the silent phone, or that icy, no longer delivered message. Those were wounds no lab could quantify. He listened without interrupting, hands loosely clasped, his body leaning slightly toward me. When I stopped talking, he stayed quiet for a few extra beats, as if weighing more than just dosages. "My wife went through chemo," he said at last. "Different cancer, but the same kind of grinding you down. There were days it felt like the treatment was trying to erase her before the disease could." He said "my wife," the way someone talks about a place they once lived in for a long time but were forced to leave. His finger no longer wore a ring, just a faint band of lighter skin. "She passed?" I asked softly. He nodded. 3 years ago. She fought to the very end. So did we." He exhaled slowly. "I started the survivorship program because I've seen too many people go through this alone. No one should have to do something like this by themselves." The word "alone" dropped between us, heavier than the room itself. He didn't ask the question everyone else did. "Do you have family?" He simply let his invitation hang there in the space between us. A young woman poked her head in. Alana, his daughter. A little while later, Brielle, his other daughter, appeared too. They greeted me like a regular adult, not a poor cancer case. For the first time in a long time, I heard someone say, "It's really nice to meet you, Ms. Maxine," and believed they meant it. When the appointment ended, he said, "I don't want to pile anything more onto you today, but if you're willing, I'd like to see you regularly, not just to monitor labs, but to make sure you don't have to carry this all alone." "I don't want to be a burden," I blurted out. "Everyone has their own life." He looked at me a beat longer. "Sometimes the heaviest thing we carry isn't the illness," he said quietly, "but the belief that needing help makes us a burden. You're not a burden, Maxine. You're a patient. You're a person. That's enough." In the weeks that followed, I would catch glimpses of him in the hallway after each treatment. Some days it was just a hand on my shoulder. "You getting home all right?" Other days, when my steps faltered, he simply said, "Come on, I'm headed that way." One rainy afternoon, he held his coat over both our heads as we dashed across the flooded parking lot. By the time we sank into our seats, damp and breathless, I realized I was smiling. "You're smiling," he said, turning on the heater. "It's good to see that." Later, he drove me to his house, a brick place on the corner that smelled of coffee and lemon-scented floor cleaner, the walls covered in family photos. I sat on the sofa, hands wrapped around a warm mug of tea, listening to Alana and Brielle moving around the house as if I'd always belonged there. We didn't talk about cancer. We talked about traffic, the best soul food spot near the hospital, how rain made the streetlights look like melted gold. For the first time in a very long time, my body understood it didn't have to tense up in every room. When he walked me to the car, the sky was a smooth gray. He paused at the door and said, "You don't have to do this alone, Maxine. Healing isn't something people are meant to do in isolation." Those words settled between us like a promise, and for the first time in a very, very long time, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, I didn't have to keep swimming through this storm by myself anymore. Healing didn't arrive like a miracle. It crept in bit by bit, one night with less sweating, one meal I could actually keep down, one morning when I realized I'd walked from the bedroom to the kitchen without having to brace myself against the wall. The scans began to reflect what my body had quietly known. The treatment plan was working. Slowly, the dark patches on the images started shrinking. Slowly, the doctors stopped using words like aggressive and began replacing them with responding well. At the clinic, the reclining chair in the infusion room gradually stopped feeling like a battlefield and started feeling more like a rest stop along the way. I began to recognize people's faces. The woman with the bright headscarf who always came with her sister. The older man who fell asleep the moment his drip started. The young mother clutching her phone like it was the last thread tying her to the outside world. I never set out to help anyone. It started with very small things. One day, the lady in the chair across from me kept struggling to adjust her blanket without tugging on her IV line. I showed her how to fold the corner of the blanket under her arm so it wouldn't pull or rub the tubing. Another time, a man's wife stepped out to take a phone call. The moment the door shut, his breathing went shallow, panic rising in his eyes. I told him about the first time my infusion pump beeped for no reason and how I'd been sure I was going to die right there. We laughed about it just long enough for his shoulders to drop, his breathing to slow, the terror to ease out of his gaze. Maybe word got around the room because the nurses started saying things like, "Ms. Maxine, would you mind sitting with Mrs. Johnson for a bit while we get her stabilized?" One afternoon, I sat in the small lounge off the main hallway, sipping weak coffee and chatting with a woman who had just started her second treatment cycle. Her hands trembled, fingers tapping nonstop against the waxy rim of her paper cup. I told her about the time I thought I couldn't stand one more round of chemo, but did it anyway. I told her about breathing through it, about letting yourself believe that what's dripping into you is work being done, not just damage being done. "You talk like you've already found your purpose," a voice said from the doorway. I turned. Brielle stood there, backpack sliding off one shoulder. "I'm just saying the things I wish someone had said to me," I replied. "Do your kids know you talk like this?" she asked. "Because it sounds exactly like what I'd want my mom to say if I were scared." This time, I didn't flinch. "I haven't been able to reach my children for years," I said plainly. "They've made their choice. Now I have to make mine." Brielle's eyes softened. "The loss is on them," she murmured. "If you've ever gone through a season when people walked away from you, but strangers were the ones who pulled up a chair beside your pain, you probably feel some part of this story. People like to believe purpose appears after some big motivational speech, but sometimes it starts with just one small sentence: you're not alone. If you're still watching at this point, try to think, at some point in your life, has anyone ever accidentally become the one who kept the chair beside you in your pain? Because right after this, that very moment is going to change the entire direction of Maxine's life. That evening, Kenneth appeared beside me. "I heard you presided over court in the lounge today," he said, the corner of his mouth lifting into a smile. "Maxine," he said, and this time my name sounded different, heavier, deeper, like recognition. "I've known you as a patient, a fighter, someone who makes other people braver," he went on. "But I'd like to know you as more than that. If you're willing, I'd like to take you to dinner, not as your doctor, but as a man who respects the woman you're becoming." "Yes," I said, my voice not loud but steady. "I'd like that." A few months later, it wasn't just about dinners anymore. We started building something bigger together. We called it the Still Breathing Survivors Circle. Kenneth said that survival demands a kind of strength that doesn't look very spectacular from the outside. One day, he slid a folder toward me, a simple line typed across the top: "Co-founders, Dr. Kenneth Rhodes and Mrs. Maxine Holloway." I stared at those words for a long time. Co-founders. My name beside his, as if it had always belonged there. In the months that followed, the program started in small, cramped rooms with mismatched chairs. We ran support circles at Henry Ford Hospital on Saturday mornings. Kenneth handled the medical side of things: numbers, side effects, treatment plans. I took care of the silence. "I never want to lie to any of you," I often told the group. "There are days when everything hurts, but you're still here. That means something. Your bodies have fought to get you to this moment. Don't pretend that isn't important." The word began to spread quietly. A social worker looked at me one day and said, "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." When a local health network decided to film a feature on post-treatment care, a producer named Denise came to ask me, "What exactly do you do in these sessions, Mrs. Holloway?" "I sit," I said. "I listen, and I tell them the truth about what it feels like to go through treatment without much support at home." "Would you mind saying that exact thing on camera?" Denise asked. The studio lights were brighter than any hospital lamp. On the screen, a small banner appeared at the bottom. Maxine Holloway, co-founder, Still Breathing Survivors Circle. I heard my own voice, clear and soft. I healed alone, but I didn't stay alone. Somewhere along this journey, I met people who chose to pull up a chair beside my pain instead of walking around it. On Sunday night, when the feature aired on WXYZ TV Detroit, somewhere in this city, Trevon was sitting at a bar when my face appeared on the screen. He saw me sitting beside Kenneth, not the fragile woman he had sealed away in his memory, but a different version, speaking calmly, eyes lit with something that looked like peace. Across town, LaToya was standing in her kitchen. She turned when she heard my voice coming from the living room TV. The dish towel slid from her hand and dropped to the floor. Trevon and LaToya saw me smile faintly. They heard Kenneth say 2 words, "My wife." Trevon's heart slammed against his ribs. All the ignored notifications, the quiet panic, seemed to crash down on him at once. "We need to reach Mom," he whispered. The morning after the broadcast, I saw the notifications. 2 names I hadn't seen on my screen in over 2 decades. LaToya, Trevon. "Mom, can I see you? I want to talk." The words just sat there, as if 25 years of silence could be swept aside by 8 of them. Kenneth looked at the message, then at me. 25 years, he said quietly, and this is how they open. "They saw the interview," I replied. "That's why they're texting." Money has its own sound when it walks into a story. I could hear that sound ringing in my head. They wanted to talk now, after seeing the organization, the funding, after realizing the woman they had left behind had built something they couldn't touch. "Only answer if it brings you peace," Kenneth said slowly. "Not out of guilt, not out of curiosity, out of peace." I didn't answer. Not then, not that day. By noon, my phone buzzed again. "I just want to talk, Mom. It's important." Right after that came a message from LaToya. "I didn't know you were doing that kind of work. I'm proud of you." The words read as if they'd been rehearsed. LaToya had always been very good at saying exactly what needed to be said, whenever she wanted something. By evening, there were 3 more messages. I tried calling. "Mom, please answer. It's urgent." I knew Trevon's business was in trouble. LaToya's marriage was wobbling. That urgent, I understood perfectly, had nothing to do with reconciliation. It had everything to do with access. On the 3rd day, I took a yellow legal pad, the kind Frederick used to use. I sat at the dining table and wrote 2 names at the top of the page. LaToya, Trevon. I started from the day of the funeral, from the sentence Trevon had thrown at me like a blade, from those first holidays without them, from the returned envelopes, the boxes stamped "Return to Sender," the messages that never got an answer. I wrote about how shame slowly became a second skin, about the nights I lay there wondering if my absence made their lives lighter. I wrote about the clinic, about the man who pulled up a chair beside my pain, about how I rebuilt a life from the wreckage they'd left behind. By the 3rd page, I wasn't writing about them anymore. I was writing about myself, about the woman who no longer waits for her children to call, about the woman who drew a line on her wedding day and swore she would never beg for love again, not even the love of her own children. When I wrote the last line, my chest felt hollow, but it was a clean kind of empty, dry, and clear. I read the letter through once, then I tore it in half, not in anger. The sound of the paper ripping was soft and merciful. I tore each page again until the words were only thin strips. I gathered them into a small pile in front of me, pressed my palm over them, thanked the woman who had needed to write that letter, and released the woman who no longer needed it to be sent. My phone buzzed again. A message from LaToya. "Mom, can I see you before things get worse for us?" The words "for us" stood out. Not for me, not for what they'd done, but for them. If you've ever had someone vanish from your life, then show up years later with a "we need to talk" message. You know how sharp that feeling can be. It's not that the words "I'm sorry," "I'm proud of you" automatically heal wounds. Sometimes the most painful part isn't the silence, but the moment they return and still act like the story is about them. If you're still watching at this point, ask yourself this. If the person who abandoned you suddenly came back right when you had finally pulled yourself together, would you open the door, slam it shut, or stand your ground in the doorway and make them face what they've done? Right after this, that was exactly the choice I had to make. After that, their tone started to shift. Guilt was brought out first. "Mom, I know I'm not perfect. I was young. I didn't know how to handle losing Dad. I made mistakes. Can we sit down and talk like a family?" Trayvon added, "I've thought about you a lot over the years. I should have reached out sooner. I'm sorry. We can't change the past, but we can fix the future." I read very carefully. If I had received these words 20 years ago, they might have melted me. But at this stage of my life, in this moment, they didn't sound like confession. They sounded like a script meant to impress. They moved on to the weapon of nostalgia. "Remember when you used to make peach cobbler and Dad would sneak spoonfuls before dinner? I miss those days. I miss you, Mom." Trayvon followed with, "Last week I drove past the old house. I remembered all the nights you stayed up late helping me with homework. You were a good mom, even if we didn't show it." A good mom. Those words came with a gentle tone, but too late. A compliment after decades of absence doesn't feel like love. It feels like strategy. By evening, it was time for the praise. "You looked amazing on TV. You seemed so strong. We're really proud of what you've built. You've done so well for yourself." Proud, done well, built. The vocabulary of people used to assessing value. Kenneth found me in the living room, my phone face down on the table. "More messages?" he asked. "This round is guilt," I said. "Guilt coated in sugar." "And how does it land on you?" he asked. "Like a contract," I answered. "The kind with fine print that says, 'Now that you're useful, Mom, we miss you.'" That night, another text popped up from Trayvon. "Mom, things have been really hard lately. The business is in trouble. We're trying to keep everything from falling apart, but we can't. We didn't want to tell you because we're ashamed. We need guidance, maybe even help. Can you meet and talk with us?" The word "help" sat right in the middle of the sentence, heavy as a stone. LaToya texted right behind him. "Mom, we're not just asking for money. We need you. We need your wisdom. You've built something big. There might be opportunities, connections, or at least advice." There it was. Not blatant greed, not a crude demand, but a slow, careful reach. Fingers inching toward the part of my life I had built without them. They said nothing about the years I was sick, nothing about the messages they had blocked, nothing about the version of me who had been on her knees, begging them to come sit with her in the grief of losing her husband and being left to stand alone. I set the phone down and looked at my own hand. The ring Kenneth had slipped onto my finger caught the light. A thin band of gold that felt heavier than gold. I heard my own voice from that day in the small room where we exchanged vows. I will never beg for love again, not even from my own children. I thought about still breathing, about all the faces turned toward me in our support circles, About Alana and Brielle, their respectful, steady, genuinely kind eyes. About the woman who had torn up the letter that would have bound her forever to an old version of herself. The phone buzzed again, shaking hard enough to slide a little across the table. "Please, Mom," Trayvon wrote, "let us see you just once before things get worse for us." For us. Not for what had happened, not for what they had done, just for themselves. The cursor blinked on the empty screen like a heartbeat, patient, steady, not demanding, but not willing to wait forever either. For a long time, I just watched it. 25 years of silence on their side, 25 years of reaching out and pulling back on mine. And now, all of those years, stuffed into one tiny reply box. The house was quiet. Evening light pushed gently against the curtains. From the kitchen, I could hear Kenneth moving, cupboard doors closing, the soft clink of dishes, the radio tuned to an old R&B station, the low hum of his voice singing along. Life. That was the sound of it. Simple, solid, clear. The sound I had begged my children for years to step into with me. Trayvon's last message still hovered at the top of the thread. "Please, Mom, let us see you just once before things get worse for us." The last two words were the truest part of everything they'd sent. For us. I thought about the woman I used to be, the one who would have rushed to answer immediately, afraid that if she didn't, this would be the last chance. The woman who counted chances like loose change, hoarding them even when all they ever bought her was pain. That woman had written her farewell on yellow paper and torn it into pieces. I put the phone down and closed my eyes. Images rose up, not in order of time, but in order of weight. The funeral pew, their bodies leaning away from me. The boxes stamped, "Return to sender." The infusion chair with the seat beside it always empty. Angela's hand on my shoulder. Kenneth's voice saying, "You don't have to fight alone." Alana and Brielle's quiet, congratulatory glances. My name on the TV screen, not as a plea, but as a legitimate presence. I opened my eyes and picked up the phone. My thumb moved slowly, each word pulled up from a part of me that had taken a long time to grow. "No." I paused. It looked small, bare, and final. But it was the truth. Not cruel, not vengeful, just right. I typed one more line. "Please do not contact me again." Those words sat on the screen, solid as brick. For years, I had begged for contact that never came. Now, I was closing a door they only knocked on when they smelled something inside they wanted. I added one last sentence, the most important one, not for them, but for me. "I am at peace." 3 sentences, short, clear, direct. There were hundreds of things I could have added. I could have listed every wound, each holiday I spent alone, every night in a dark room wondering what I had done so wrong that my own children could live as if I were dead. I could have drawn them a detailed map of every place they'd gone wrong and handed it to them, pointing out exactly where they'd taken the wrong turn. But I had lived it already. I didn't need to write it again. "You okay?" Kenneth's voice came from the doorway. I hadn't heard him walk in. He leaned against the frame, eyes soft, reading my face like a doctor reads a scan. "Yes," I said, and this time the word wasn't a mask. "I think I'm okay." He stepped closer, close enough that I could feel his warmth without him having to touch me. "Whatever you send," he said, "make sure it tells the truth about who you are now. Not the woman who had to grit her teeth to survive what they did to you." I nodded, tilting the screen so he could see. He read each line in silence. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. "Clear," he said at last, "and kind, in its own way." "The kindest thing I can do," I whispered, "is not open a door I have no intention of keeping open." He nodded, as if bowing to the woman sitting there with the phone in her hand. Then he went back to the kitchen, leaving me space for this part of the journey, the step that, no matter how supported you are, still has to be taken by your own 2 feet. I looked at the message one last time. No anger, no drama, no long explanation, just a boundary carved cleanly after years of jagged, painful edges. Then I hit send. No swelling music, no special effects. The message slid into the thread and lay there like a stone at the bottom of a river, motionless under the rushing current of all the words they had sent. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then Trayvon's typing bubble appeared, popped up, disappeared. LaToya's indicator blinked once, then went dark. Whatever words were forming on their tongues ran into the wall I had just built and fell in silence. I opened my settings and went into each conversation. Trayvon's first, then LaToya's. My thumb hovered over the option, a silent question hidden inside a tiny digital action. Then I tapped block this caller for both, confirming what my heart had decided long ago. The phone felt heavy in my hand, but it was no longer a bomb waiting to go off. No more preview banners, no more sudden buzzing, no more panic of their chaos spilling into the quiet life I had fought to rebuild. I set the phone on this table. Leaning back in my chair, I felt the weight slide off my shoulders layer by layer, layers I hadn't even known were still there. In the space where their noise used to live, there was now only the radio in the kitchen and the soft clink of glass as Kenneth washed dishes. The life I had built, a marriage, an organization, a name no longer hanging on my children's approval, stood solid around me, clear and whole as walls rooted deep in the ground. Whatever storms they were facing out there, they stopped right at my doorstep. What I had built in their absence was here, full and intact, and this time, no one was going to tear it down. If it were you, the one who'd sent hundreds of unanswered messages, who'd cried through long nights because your own flesh and blood chose to live as if you didn't exist, then one day, they come back. Not because they suddenly miss you, but because they can see your life is different now, better, stronger, fuller. What would you do? Open the door, slam it shut, or stand tall in the doorway and say, "This life is no longer yours to come and go from as you please." If someone's face is in your mind right now as you listen, hold on to them. Maxine's answer is coming. And maybe it will help you find your own. The first time our organization hosted its own event, not in a hospital room or a borrowed space, I stood at the back of the hall for a while just to watch. People moved through the room with plates of snacks and cups of juice, name tags sitting slightly crooked on their chests. Some still carried the marks of treatment, scarves over bare heads, pale skin, cautious steps. Others were years out, faces fuller, laughter gradually returning. They weren't there because they felt broken. They were there because they had survived and wanted to keep living that way. On one wall hung a simple banner, Still Breathing Survivors Circle, Life After the Last Infusion. Just below, a screen looped through photos, support circles, community walks, quiet moments captured between sessions. Every so often my own face appeared, mid-sentence, eyes on someone outside the frame. Alana stood near the volunteer table, handing leaflets to a couple who looked like they'd fought hard just to show up. She nodded toward me as she spoke, and I watched the woman's shoulders ease down a little. Brielle worked near the back door, organizing the sign-in sheets, brow furrowed in concentration. The two of them moved through the room as if they belonged, not as owners, not as supervisors, but as part of something bigger than all of us. Kenneth found me near the punch bowl. "Are you hiding?" he asked, smiling. "I'm observing," I corrected him. "Big difference. So what do you see?" I looked around. Small groups, deep in conversation. A woman from our earliest support circles laughing with a man I recognized from a later group. Angela, with her bright scarf, quietly gathering used paper cups. A few doctors standing in a corner, listening more than they talked. I see. A life. I said softly. A life I didn't know I was allowed to live. He nodded. He didn't ask for more. That was one of the first gifts he ever gave me, the space to feel something without being required to present it. That night, after the last chair had been stacked and the final light at the venue turned off, we went home. I sat on the sofa, legs tucked under a blanket. Alana and Brielle stopped by, dropping off a stack of leftover programs, then stayed for tea and the remaining cookies. They talked about exams, internships, the small, ordinary details of their own lives, the kind of everyday things I once thought I'd only ever hear from my own children. When Brielle got up to leave, she hugged Kenneth first, then turned to me. "Good night, Miss Maxine," she said warmly. "You can drop the Ms." I smiled. "Just Maxine is fine." She grinned and nodded. Then, "Good night, Maxine." She didn't try to make me into her mother. She didn't push me away like a stranger. She put me exactly where I belonged, someone important, but not someone to be used. When the door closed behind them, the house settled back into its usual rhythm. No echo, no screaming emptiness suddenly filled, just a home that knew exactly who lived in it. I picked up the remote, flipped through a few channels, then stopped at a familiar program. The station was re-airing the health segment, the one that had made Traven and LaToya sit up like someone had yanked them by the ear. Our interview was tucked between segments on heart disease and diabetes. I watched myself walk into frame again, same dress, same calm posture. My name glided across the bottom. Maxine Holloway, co-founder, Still Breathing Survivors Circle. The night it aired live, I had watched like a woman bracing for impact, even as I pretended I wasn't. Tonight, I looked and saw a woman who had gone through the impact and was still standing. On the screen, I heard my own voice. I healed alone, but I didn't stay alone. The camera cut to Kenneth listening beside me, then to patients' faces nodding in the support circle, then to a close-up of my hands resting loosely, open, not defensive, not clenched. My phone lay on the table, dark, still. No new messages from the names I once prayed over every night. They couldn't reach me anymore. Not through my phone, not through politeness-wrapped panic, not through repentance that only arrived once their own lives began to collapse. I had closed that door and walked away. "I used to think I'd lost my family," I said quietly, half to Kenneth, half to the woman on the screen. He glanced over from his chair. "And now?" he asked. I thought of all the people who had poured their fears out in front of me, trusting me to lift them gently. Of Alana and Brielle making room for me without asking me to erase anyone else to take their place. Of the man at the sink, humming an old tune as he washed dishes in our kitchen. I thought of the woman who had once knelt, begging for love as if it were oxygen, and of the woman now, still breathing steadily, even with no one standing on the other end of the line. "I didn't lose my family," I said, feeling a truth settle into its rightful place. "I just lost the people who never really wanted me." Silence filled the room, but it wasn't empty. It was packed with everything I had built while no one was watching, full of what had grown in the soil, left bare by their absence. The segment ended. The screen shifted to another story, then another. I turned off the TV. The room grew darker, but inside me, nothing was dark anymore. Some things, once you've moved beyond them, never go back to the way they were. Not because they're broken, but because you've walked far enough not to hear the dragging chains of what once hurt you. I stood, folded the blanket, and climbed the stairs to where Kenneth was waiting. To the life we were building day by day, choice by choice, moment by moment, saying no to letting the past steal the peace of the present. This time, there was no hesitation, no guilt, no more asking, "Do I deserve this?" I just walked forward, toward the light, toward love, toward a life I no longer need anyone's permission to live. If you've stayed with me this far, there's probably a door in your heart like Maxine's, one you once knocked on until your knuckles burned, now left with only silence and exhaustion. If this story has touched you, Leave a comment. Where are you on your own journey of standing on the side of your peace? And if you want to keep hearing stories like this, about healing, boundaries, and people who thought they were lost but found themselves again, hit subscribe, turn on the notification bell so we can meet each other again in the journeys yet to come.